Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigus.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Fly Culture Podcast. This week, I've got a friend of the podcast, Paul Gaskell, who is back to talk about his season. He's going to share some fishing tips and talk about his fascinating new book, The Nature of Fly Fishing. Paul, it's great to welcome you back to the podcast again. Are you well?
I'm pretty well, and I'm just always overwhelmed with the, gratitude for you actually having me on these things to share the strange contents of my brain from time to time. So I'm doing okay.
I'm pleased to hear that. And, well, if the last podcast is anything to go by, it seemed to be incredibly popular with listeners. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. And I know that we're going to dial down into the book, which is a fascinating subject in itself. And I know anglers are going to get a hell of a lot from it. But I wanted to really, we're sitting here and we're in early October when we were actually recording this. And it's one of those reflective times, isn't it, that we're looking back on the season. I can't think that there's many people saying it's been one of the most memorable ones. How's it been for you, though?
Yeah, it's fair to say it's been an interesting one, isn't it? Particularly because a lot of my focus is on river fishing. So that's so dependent on the water levels we've had. And of course, we had quite a strange spring that was kind of both cold for periods of time and then things were late and then it kind of accelerated and everything got crazy. And then we just had that massive long drought. And particularly on some of the small streams, I'm a real kind of one of my secret passions, I guess, is fishing small trout streams. I think there's a lovely intimacy to those. And many of the venues that I fish are actually above any kind of like tailwater systems and reservoirs, so they don't get any compensation flow, and they're already pretty small to start with. So pretty slim pickings for a lot of that. However, what I would say, some of those higher elevation streams, they did fish surprisingly well because they were able to maintain cool water that trout obviously love. So even in those skinny conditions, when the water was cool enough for me to feel that, catch and release was a responsible thing to do, I actually had some quite good and some interesting experiences on, surprisingly skinny and thin bits of water. So that was quite interesting. And of course, this time of year, we're kind of transitioning our thoughts towards grayling, those of us who enjoy targeting that species. So I've done a little bit in that direction so far. And I had a very interesting, a very rewarding, in fact, guiding experience recently with a couple of new clients. And we went on a fairly well-fished section of one of my local rivers. And it was just, it highlighted that that principle, I guess, of where you get popular waters, having something that tackles a familiar situation or a familiar challenge, but in a slightly different way, just offering them a slightly different look to the ordinary, the run-of-the-mill. That really paid dividends, and it greatly transformed a day, actually, that was started out pretty hard. But my clients kind of kept the faith, and they both enjoyed some good success. So the relief was palpable once we kind of unlocked it. But yeah, it was the short version of it was that these white beadhead sort of olive nymph imitations seemed to be the thing that they were absolutely craving on that particular day. So yeah, that went down pretty well. So yeah, a mixed bag of a season, I would say, but not without its fascinating challenges and some very rewarding experiences as well. So yeah, I've been happy overall because I was surprised at the contentment that I found on stream, despite some of the obvious worries about the environment. I think some hope, I guess, for resilience within these systems, and the fact that if we do our best to relieve a few of these bottlenecks, then perhaps we can help these rivers to be around for future generations, which is obviously really important.
And it's fascinating. I wrote something on my personal Facebook about how it felt that fishing was changing a little bit. And you touched on something there, saying when it was right to fish for catch and release. And that's one of the things I really noticed throughout this warm spell, and certainly where we are down here, we just didn't really, there was a long period that I just didn't feel it was right to go fishing, so I didn't. And the lovely thing was seeing that I wasn't alone. And there were so many people feeling, yeah, fish. Do you detect that is a little bit of a change? And, the much maligned social media, there's always these arguments against it. And I can think of many, many, many. But when I see that, it's a great way to spread that, isn't it? And see that people are actually saying, I'm not going to go out because it's not right to do that. Have you sensed that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, although in some senses you end up with the social media feed that you deserve. So the kind of stuff that you put out there and the kind of stuff that interests you and that you latch onto is, that's what the algorithms will serve up to you. Now, that can be a negative thing because obviously if you feel the need to kind of really, and quite rightly, comment on things that you strongly disagree on, then sometimes that can be quite a negative spiral. But at the same time, if you're still putting out positive things, then that definitely does help. And what I would say is that there's a risk sometimes for some of the good messages to come across as a little bit of like a stick to beat people with, because people love being right. They love to tell people the way that it is. So you may see some very keen new young anglers, and they may be getting stick for the exact same things that the people that are kind of like, outragedly typing into their keyboards, so that they've done exactly the same thing until, hopefully the more nurturing aspect of the fishing community kind of brings them, to a slightly better understanding. But I do think that whether it's clumsily done or slightly more gently and artfully, there seems to be a bit of a move towards, being a bit more responsible to protect this resource that we've got and how precious it is. A little bit less, I think, of the kind of more the perhaps what you'd maybe term the old school sort of like, catch and kill everything and it's got to be for the table, and heavy reliance on stockfish. I think there's a growing sort of appreciation for fish that sustainably kind of reproduce themselves in the environment that you go and fish for them. So yeah, I think I'm not saying that, everybody's in agreement, but yeah, like you, I sense a bit of a move towards things where it's a bit more of an appreciation of the wild and the natural resources that we've got, and being a bit more responsible with it. So yeah, I do sense that movement, and that is driven, I think, very much by, people coming into the sport and then looking for, well, what are the values and what are the ethos sort of values that you should adopt or that exist in this community, and are they correct? And so yeah, I think people coming in and the responsibility of people already within the community, it's kind of it's at that junction between those two demographics, and there is a bit of a sea change. I think you're right in saying that.
Yeah, and I've also noticed that it's not the end product, the fish. It's been, for me, hugely pleasing to see shots of where the people are fishing. I love seeing and imagining in my mind's eye where that fish may be. It may be the end of the day. It may be, more than just somebody sitting down, and we always put a picture of me smoking a cigar and my buddy Warren smoking a pipe as part of that day. And that seems, do you think that sort of extra part of it is also impacting that it's not just about the fish, it's about fishing?
I hope so, and I think, and I must give huge kudos to Fly Culture, both in the printed form and in the podcast form, for helping to promote that. Because at the end of the day, fishing in general and fly fishing in particular, it's about the experience of it. Because if it were only about the fish, the end result, then we might as well all be dynamite fishermen. It's not in the having, it's the it's the getting, and it's the process and everything that goes along with that makes it rich and valuable, at least in my opinion. And I think that's possibly why I'm slightly jealous of a lot of the fishing culture in Japan, because they seem to do that sort of experiential and social side of it a lot better. Possibly because they have to, they have to go to such a lot of effort to actually go and experience that. So they'll drive from the most populated areas in the cities. It's usually a minimum of a 3-hour drive, and actually often 8, 9, 10 hours. I know Kurasan, one of my friends, he regularly drives 13 or 14 hours because he doesn't like paying the roll fees, the tolls on some of the freeways they have over there. And he'll spend that for like a weekend or a long weekend in the mountains. And then because of that, they have these really social, barbecue and drinking events, and everyone's exchanging ideas. And it's not this kind of closed shop where they're trying to keep the methods sort of secret, that they're really keen to share what's working and why. And also just meet up with friends that may come from very, very, disparate and spread out areas. So it does make me smile sometimes when people say, oh, I don't have trout streams near me. I'd have to drive 5 hours to, so I don't fly fish or whatever. And it's like, well, people in Japan are like, yeah, that's like a short drive for them. So anybody who's like a trout fisherman in Japan, usually it means they're kind of driving sort of 10 hours each way to sort of do some of that. So yeah, we probably lack a bit of commitment sometimes.
I've often in the past said, well, if I was in Montana, I wouldn't be whinging about driving so far. And that sort of keeps me going. Thank you for the kind words about the magazine as well and what we're trying to do. And rather than preach, we've just said, look, this is how we feel about it. And it's been easier to do that. And it reminded, and obviously you know about it, when we headed out to Italy and everyone was a fly culture reader and they got it immediately. And there was no sort of, not that there needs to be, but a competitive element. There's no trying to, everyone fish with each other. We just had the most fantastic time. And I think I said to you that I was reminded of you when I saw when you'd fished down there with Susan as well, Susan Scrooper, another friend of the podcast, that bit of stream with the brook trout in at the bottom of the mountains. It's a pretty amazing place to fish, isn't it?
Unbelievable. I mean, the Val di Fumo, it's Valley of Smoke. It's surreal to even be there. Never mind to fish it. And strangely enough, the feeling and the social nature of the fishing community in the Dolomites in Italy, that's one of the most similar senses that I've had to the anglers in Japan as well. And I think it's possibly something to do with the mountains and the mountain culture and people being in tune with that environment. I don't know. I mean, without getting too pretentious, well, screw it. Let's get really pretentious. But when people who drink wine, they talk about the terroir of it, so it's like the essence of the landscape that finds its way into the flavor of the wine. And I think the same thing is really true of fishing and fishing cultures and the people that are surrounding it. So mountain stream trout fishing, I think there's probably kind of a kinship between many different cultures around the world that sort of share a passion for that particular activity, and it's really infectious and it's deeply passionate, and they're very proud of it, and rightly so.
Do you think also, and I'm thinking about those streams there, and I remember Stefano told me that there was a huge amount of rivers around there. Do you think it may also be that it is not competitive, but there's so much water to go round that you're not fighting to get a beat? You can, it's do we touch on public land? Is it something to do with that as well, perhaps?
Do you know what? That's something I've never really considered. And to be fair, that's probably, my fault for sitting within the kind of, just accepting the English system, where certainly in, let's say, that around the home counties in England, that sort of land ownership and the value of the real estate, and therefore the premium sort of price of access to some of that trout fishing, you sort of, and actually even when you're talking about the more affordable sort of fly fishing around the country, there's still that presumption really that it probably belongs to an estate or to, there's a fishing club, or it's, day tickets on rivers are still relatively unusual, but even having to do that compared to systems where you have this great wide open geography and landscape where you may get regional permits and you'll have to, sort of pay a particular fee to access certain areas and certain beats. But oftentimes that's really quite a modest fee, and it's also operated in more of a cooperative fashion. Literally, they're set up as cooperatives very often, to kind of, manage the reserve, if you like, the game reserve of these sort of rivers. And it's a very, very different feeling and ethos. And I think we're probably quite strange in the UK, really, in our approach to that. But possibly that's, a function of us being a small island and that being a different kind of resource, and the land around it being treated and valued in a different way as well.
Yeah, it did make me wonder if that were the case. And even, bumping into other guides or whatever, you could just jump off and head somewhere else. And it worked really, really well. Similarly in the States, and I think in the States there's fish per mile. There's so many that it doesn't seem to impact things in quite the same way. But it was interesting you touched on guiding as well. There's nothing like the first fish in the net of the day when you're guiding, is there?
100%. I mean, beforehand, I always kind of say, look, there's many different styles of guiding. And with me, what I try to do is to find out what it is you need or want to kind of improve or work on or experience, and then we'll go from there. But I'm also keen to say that whatever we do, my aim is to arm you with sort of abilities and improve sort of chances on your future. I don't so much. In fact, I can't remember the last time I took on a client where it was like, I want to be put on fish, and it's just about catching those fish on that day, and then it's like a transactional thing, like money for fish caught. I kind of basically filter out people that are after that and send them to other people that may be more suited to provide that. So I'm not looking to sort of say, right, this is a transactional thing where I'm going to put you on loads of fish and that's the end of it. What I'm trying to do is arm you with skills that mean that you have more consistent and more predictable and better experiences in future. But at the same time, I'd be absolutely lying if I said that, it's not important to actually validate that some of the things I'm teaching you actually work. So you need to kind of have that proof of the pudding for you to have confidence to go out and, try it for yourself and use that. So, yeah, that first fish of the day and that first proof of concept is super important. And it's very satisfying as well. I'm not poo-pooing people that want to go out and catch fish, because that's, if we were satisfied with, the first fish that we caught, we'd never need to go fishing again. So there is an element of trying to repeat that experience. So yeah, it's definitely baked into it, even though I try to dial back perhaps the instantaneous importance of that. So it's a bit like delayed gratification, so that you can have more and more rewarding experiences in the future.
Yeah, it's that lovely feeling, and then you feel a little bit taller, a little bit when that particularly when you've called a play as well. And you said, it's fascinating, the white beads on olive nymphs. There's a tip for listeners already if they haven't used them. And I've sort of played with them a little bit, and I've not played with them for a while. Is that just before we sort of start talking about some other stuff? Is that a fly that you have and a bead colour that you have a lot of faith in, or was it a moment that you called that, playing it, and you felt it was the right thing to do at that moment?
I mean, strangely enough, I tied up probably half a dozen of that particular pattern. I'd never tied it before. I tied it up the day before the guiding trip, just because I was thinking, I know broadly what's going to be on the menu, but how can we show them something just to make them a different offer to everybody else's flies? I do tend to have quite a lot of faith in white beads as a kind of as a fish attracting mechanism or a tool, but I also really like them for sight fishing as well, where there's the opportunity. So there's kind of I've been chatting about this a little bit recently in various sort of formats, but I like the idea of being able to design features into the fly that actually benefit the angler, as whether or not they kind of improve the attractiveness of the fly. So one of those things is that particularly in peaty streams, or actually in quite a lot of different rivers where you've got a slightly darker background, that white bead actually shows up really well without it being like a screaming, loud, sort of in your face sort of fluorescent colour that might actually, again, be something that puts off fish that see a lot of flies and maybe see a lot of gaudy sort of patterns that are maybe a bit too much and a bit too full on. So I like it because it's not frightening, but it is really visible as well. So you can sort of sight fish with it and sort of track it through the water when the conditions are right, obviously. So yeah, I like it for several reasons. And obviously, when you are guiding, you like to stack up those and compound those advantages where you can. So some of it's for the fish and some of it's for the anglers. So yeah, I would definitely urge people to give it a go from that respect. But in terms of sort of, attractive bead colours, I know, it's probably a very poorly kept secret, but that kind of very pale, washed out pink colour that's quite hard to get. It's quite a pastel-y sort of shade of pink. That's not a million miles away from a white bead either. And that's on sort of hare's ears and pheasant tails and olive nymphs. It seems to have a little bit of a magic fish attracting property, at least at the moment, till everyone starts using it.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think I've got some, as I often say on here, I've just not been tying flies. And I think I may have some of those pastel-y pink ones somewhere or other. And funnily enough, I think to myself, and it is funny that I remember the first time I saw a white bead used, and it was my friend Toby and I were fishing the stream, and he flipped this white bead. It probably would have been a hare's ear, because I know he liked always hare's ear with a orange or red bead on it, but I'd not seen the white beads before. I think they just at the time become available, and he flipped into a spot and we watched a trout scream across to eat it. It charged it down. And you sort of kind of think of those. And even as someone who fishes a little bit, you remember that, you use it, and then it sort of comes away again. And exactly what you were saying about peaty, slightly coloured water, that's the water I fish. I suppose a lot of the trout season I'm fishing a dry fly only. So that may be the reason I'm trying to back myself out of this now a little bit. So that might be the reason that I don't tend to fish nymphs during the trout season. But I think I'm going to dig some out. You may have even prompted me to get behind the vice again and try it. But it's interesting, isn't it, that we get into a familiar mindset, and then it would be a Duracell fly for me or whatever it may be, because they work. And then you sort of forget about those. Then you come full circle to a pheasant tail with a redneck or orange or whatever. And that still bloody works fantastically as well, doesn't it? It's funny how, and your book, I know we're going to talk about this, but I often talk about the mental aspect of how we approach our fishing, and often how a fly can be hidden away in the corner of a fly box that we don't use, that has worked really well for us. I guess we're all guilty of that to a degree, aren't we?
Yeah, of course. And I think it sometimes is quite nice to fall into and lapse into sort of like a habitual groove as well. I think there's something comforting about that. And then when the fish happen to kind of, endorse that decision, then it sort of, it kind of has a bit of a flywheel effect, I guess. But yeah, I suppose unpacking that a little bit, one of the things that I find fascinating and rewarding about fly fishing is that there are so many different ways you can skin a cat. You can get to the same result by different routes, and it's nice. And it's nice to play with some of the building blocks of why those different approaches might work. And doesn't necessarily need to be a single fly that takes you down a certain route. You can get down that same route using multiple different flies, or you can come in from completely from left field and use some different mechanism and a different sort of cohort of flies to do that. So I like the idea that you can pick from this very rich menu, but at the same time, if you want to, you can really simplify it down to some very a very restricted palette, if you like, of patterns and options. And you can really get right down to sort of using like a couple of variations of a single pattern that will perform in a few different ways, if you want to. And there's elegance and enjoyment in that as well, putting the focus more on your presentation and how you sort of set things up to support that presentation as much as the fly. So the fly is a very relatively minor sort of tool that's part of that, just one cog in that whole system, if you like. So yeah, it just gives you that complete rich tapestry of different options of how you want to enjoy and experience your fly fishing. And there's not too many activities like that, I don't think. And I think that's where part of the addiction comes from when it comes to our particular sort of, preferences and enjoyments on stream.
I think that's beautifully put. And I think I often say that that's why I keep coming back to this, because I'm always looking to try and be a little bit better, to learn a little bit more, to understand a little bit more. And I think that's why I keep coming back to it. But this segues beautifully onto your book, The Nature of Fly Fishing. And to me, having read it, it is an excellent read. To me, though, you are linking biology and how, as anglers, we can learn from it. Would that be a fair sort of summary of it, really?
Yeah, I think that's the boiled down thing of what it tries to do. And I'm acutely aware that it's a book that's not going to be for everybody because it dives quite deep into it to try and explain the why. Why do fish do the things that they do, and why and how anglers can sort of experience and manipulate that in a way. But at the same time, I suppose maybe taking a step back from that, it's my attempt to share a kind of a view of fly fishing as an activity and the river corridor through the lens of a kind of a biologist and an ecologist, and those two can be sort of slightly different things depending on the context as well. And it's something that I only, again, calling back to before about sort of taking things for granted by, living in the country that we do and the way that land and river ownership is set up, you only sort of get a perspective for that when you step outside of it. But because I'd grown up with a real deep obsession for freshwater biology, and it was kind of inevitable that would something to do with my career would be based around, that subject. I've always seen fishing through the eyes of a kind of a biologist, a naturalist, an ecologist. And it's only when you get into conversation with people and sort of start broadening out, your social interactions, and it's another role of social media, of course, is bringing perspective and other people's perspective to things. It's like, oh, some of this stuff isn't just kind of like, inherently understood. It just doesn't. It's not something that you're already, born with, essentially, almost. So it was an attempt really to kind of share how I built my approach to fly fishing, and that in doing so, in actually writing the book, that's forced me to actually kind of unpick that and understand things, or try to understand things that I'd really taken for granted and I didn't realize that I was doing. So it's kind of quite a deeply introspective process as well, and in many ways, I ended up writing the book in a different way to where I've kind of approached some of the other things that I've either produced or written. And it's really quite a selfish book, because it's like, well, this is really what I think, and this is truly what the value I think I can give to people, whether or not they want it. So it's kind of like, this is what's been going on, in my sort of angling experience. Take it or leave it. It might be, hopefully, there is value in it, but I'm at least being completely open and transparent and honest about it. And I'm not writing to a formula where it's like, I can do this keyword research and I'm going to target that segment of the market, and then I'm going to build it, exactly to sort of, tick those boxes. It's much more personal than that, from, going from, why I became an angler in the first place, through to all of these different little bits of experience and epiphanies that I've had through studying biology alongside fishing the whole time. And that's where it kind of gets interesting for me, because people that find out that I'm sort of interested in the science side of it assume that I don't go out fishing all the time, and that I'm not, trying these things out and enjoying them and adding to the a more enriched experience of my fishing while I'm going fishing all the time. So it's not about kind of sitting in an ivory tower and sort of, stroking my chin and having deep thoughts about things without ever kind of picking up a fly rod or getting near to that sort of aspect of it. It's more how I can't any longer separate those two things. I can't separate the experience of fly fishing from viewing the kind of tapestry of a river corridor through the kind of the different interactions that all the living things have there, and then therefore appreciating my place and my position within that whole food web a little bit more keenly, and hopefully with, revealing a bit more of the beauty of some of that, tapestry of interwoven sort of competing, sometimes mutualistic kind of relationships between all the different plants and animals in that river corridor. So hopefully it adds colour to the fly fishing experience. That's at least what I've tried to do, and I've tried to share it as openly and as authentically as possible. And in doing so, it digs into some, there's a lot of text, it's quite a short book because I didn't want to make it difficult to read and like a slog. So it's short, but compared to a lot of my other publications, there's very few illustrations. It is a reading book. It's a book to sit down and read and kind of absorb, take some of the things, cherry pick some of the ideas, try them out on stream, come back to the text, that kind of thing. But it's in taking that approach and sort of outlining those ideas. Hopefully it reveals some of that sort of experience that might be hidden otherwise. And that's really, the overall aim of it is to try and reveal some of those things and share it in a way that is digestible. But at the same time, there is going to be the odd, graph in there, and that might make a certain portion of the angling public, flee in terror and sort of start, throwing shoes at the book from the other side of the room. But those are really kept to a minimum. There's maybe 6 or 7 illustrations like that, and some of them are little diagrams, and there's the odd one which is a graph. But it's only because that's the simplest way of sort of showing the end result of some really deep and quite complex and confusing ideas, but sort of showing that as clearly and as concisely as possible.
And you do that, and I think you're saying that it's a texty book. Yes, it is, but it's not overly complicated. I was sitting, what it does, and I know you reference Richard Dawkins and The Selfish Gene in there, which is a fine book, and I've read many of his books until he got on a crusade about things. And if you've read those in the past, you will enjoy that. But it made me think about the fish that I'm interacting with, and it's sort of in some places, and we'll come on to that, reinforced what I'd thought about fish as well, plus a whole lot more. So it's not overly, I'm not sitting there thinking I'm reading a science paper, because it's nowhere near or anything like that. What it does is make you think. And I'm suspecting possibly that's what you wanted from this, listening to what you've said just now. I'm suspecting, was that what you were hoping from it? Because it worked on one of your readers, certainly myself.
Absolutely. And again, calling back to that idea of it being a very authentic representation of how I built these ideas, the Selfish Gene was something I was exposed to very, around about the time I was doing A-levels, so kind of 17, 18 years of age. Dawkins is obviously quite a polarizing character, but that book in and of itself, it's kind of one of those books that when you pick it up and read it, it makes you, the reader, feel like an absolute genius. I nearly swore then. A complete genius. Because it's like those kind of one of those light bulb things where it's like, oh shit, that completely explains those otherwise confusing things. And that's that. And so in a small way, I was trying to do a similar thing. And what I wanted to get as far away from as possible is a listing out of kind of dry rote facts that you learn more facts than somebody else, and you have more knowledge, and therefore you end up better than them, and you can use that as a stick to bit. This book is the opposite of that. What it tries to do is to share the way that I think about things that has helped me, and hopefully that some of those things might also help you. And whether that is help in the sense of appreciating the intricacies or the beauty of the places that you fish, or whether it's in terms of some slightly improved success and maybe the chance of some more red letter days and sort of precious memories of, memorable and rewarding captures on the stream. So it's more about the concept. It's trying to lift the concepts and the ideas up above just the dry facts. And I mention it in the book, and I've mentioned it in some of the promo material as well, that it's the last thing I want to kind of promote is the idea that if you know more Latin names of, invertebrates than another angler, then that makes you better than them. It's like, yes, classification, identification, those things are super important. And I'm in awe of people that have amazing kind of encyclopedic knowledge of like exactly how many hairs there are on a particular joint of a leg of a particular insect. That's absolutely necessary, and it's extremely valuable. At the same time, that's not really what this book is about. This is about celebrating what you might call trait-based ecology. So it's the characteristics and the character and the flavor of the different biological components and how they interact together. And so it's, I guess the idea is that I don't think there's really any such thing as an original idea. I think what there is original ways of taking things that are apparently very separate and then actually realizing that you can kind of join them together in some way. And so that's what I've tried to do. So I'm fascinated by this idea that, genes actually, all they are is little things that build these survival vehicles around them. And some of those survival vehicles might be a trout or a grayling. And then those genes that have created these little vehicles, they go out into like a landscape of the environment, and then that filters out the ones that have made good designs and the ones that made poor designs from the ones that have made good designs, and then they're the ones that go on to breed. And then if that landscape is complex enough, then that filter is complicated, so that can create some really elegant and intricate behaviors and adaptations. And so on the one side you've got this kind of very techie, sciencey process that's going on, and then on the other you get something as poetic and beautiful as a grayling fin that is just one of the most beautiful things in nature. And it's kind of linking those things up really and appreciating that whole sort of elegant process. So it's an aim to share a view of the world and the thinking processes behind it, and some of the things that have informed that, and where we can take those things from behavioral ecology, maybe studies in birds or invertebrates or whatever, and then see what that can tell us about how fly fishing works. Excuse me, frog in my throat. So yeah, again, another theme that I keep coming back to is that oftentimes when you start to dig into this kind of thing, people that don't really want to change the worldview at all, the barrier that they'll put up is often like, well, there's no such thing as a talking trout, and therefore until we find one, there's no point speculating about this stuff. It's pointless because we'll never know what... The thing is, there's an entire field of research that's been dedicated to looking at, well, how do we indirectly get a handle on why these behaviors are happening? We probably wouldn't have had much sort of material published by, Jane Goodall or people like that if they said, well, until gorillas can talk, we might as well not bother looking at what they do and why and what lessons we can learn from that, So, yeah, it's a way of indirectly using some of the stuff that ecologists and biologists have known for decades, but we just never really talk about in fly fishing. So that seems to give me the permission to write the book, because I don't see it. The ideas in there, I don't see them really talked about, particularly in other publications. Aside from, and I certainly give kudos in the book to Bob Wyatt's work, in particular trout hunting. I sort of fit that into where that sits in the sort of the things that I think about, and in some ways how I sort of extend beyond what Bob has sort of talked about in trout hunting, and where that perhaps sits in the overall landscape, if that makes sense. I don't know if you took that from the reading of it.
Absolutely, yeah. I can see that in there. And then, of course, you referenced it as well. And I think there is a section that almost implies trout hunting, doesn't it? And then at the end, you're saying how much you got from that. And I would say to listeners, if you haven't already, Bob White has been a guest on the podcast previously. It's definitely worth a listen to hear his thoughts on the behaviour of trout and fly patterns and everything else. Coming back to your book, though, Paul, I like how it's broken down, being a trout, being a grayling, and being a fly angler as well, and then delves down into that. And as you've alluded to, it talks about the survival of the fittest along the Dawkins sort of line, yet with a whole lot more information with it as well. You talk about, and I wanted to just touch some questions that came up in my head. And again, this is, you talk about expended energy versus calorific intake when it comes to a hatch. And I'm reminded of the story, and you talked about red letter days, and you talk about a large grayling that you caught and how it didn't move far from its preferred feeding lane. That sort of reinforced those things for you, did it?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm sort of cherry picking small examples from many that I could have taken, but I think that idea of calories in and calories out, and how that trout and grayling have to maintain a balance sheet, it's pretty core to the way that I approach a lot of fishing. So, I think it's one of the reasons that when the original Klinkhamer special was kind of invented, I mean, that was tied on a kind of like a size 6 hook, I want to say, like a really, really big hook. And the seemingly supernatural power of that fly to pull up a fish that was lying in sort of 4 feet of water on the bed of the river, and it coming all the way up to nail it, that was one of the kind of clues to like, oh, hang on a minute, yeah, I've seen something similar to this when when I've made it to a lecture, doing my undergrad degrees back in the day, and I didn't have too much of a hangover to take some of this stuff in. The sort of that, I mean, in the book, I include that classic experiment of foraging starlings when they were trying to work. What was the optimum number of leather jacket, so cranefly larvae, should they sort of forage from a patch and then take back to the nest to feed their chicks? And you get this kind of really interesting relationship that basically the further they have to fly from the nest to where they actually obtain their cranefly larvae, that influences the number of leather jackets that they then take back to feed their brood with, which is obviously, they're ensuring that the more copies of those genes go further down. So that kind of, calls back to the idea of these survival vehicles that genes build. And so the ability to kind of link that experiment in starlings, a kind of bird, to what we might tie on the end of our tippet is kind of, that's an interesting concept to me. And that's just one example of the kind of links that I've made in the book. But there's a lot more. And in fact, actually, later on in the book, when I'm talking about being an angler, I'm talking about how sometimes this might be particularly pertinent to competition anglers, but it's the same if you want to sort of prove to yourself that you've read a piece of water correctly. The idea of optimal foraging, which is basically you spend as long in one patch, and a good way to think about it is when you're blackberry picking, for example, you spend as long in one patch to actually remove the number of blackberries that mean that patch then drops to the average abundance of blackberries for the whole kind of area that you're foraging in. So when you start off, there's dozens of berries there, and you can get loads very quickly. And then obviously, as it gets to be more depleted, there comes a time when you do better by moving to another patch where there's dozens of berries, rather than trying to get every last one out of that particularly thorny bit. And that's an interesting idea, because what it essentially predicts is that you should leave that value at which you leave that patch. So when you stop fishing in one spot and move somewhere else, the rate at which you're encountering fish, that should be constant across all of the river. So you should always leave when it reaches that sort of spot. Now, I'm not suggesting you go out with a pen and paper and kind of calculate that, but if you have a kind of a gut appreciation for that, that can make you feel like you're more in tune with a particular river and you've kind of read it correctly and that kind of thing. But something I didn't put in the book is the apparent paradox between, when I'm talking about the starlings, they collect more leather jackets when they've got further to fly. But I've just said the value, that patch value, it's called, the marginal value, as it's kind of referred to in the ecology, that should be constant. So how come they're taking more from the same patch if they've got further to fly? And strangely enough, the answer is actually hidden in the book itself, which is that it's not the blunt number of kind of resources that you take, it's the rate that you acquire them at. So if you've got a longer journey to make, that reduces your rate of acquisition because you need to spend more time traveling than you do eating or collecting. So yeah, there's little. It's to me, one of the fascinating things is when you've got relatively simple rules and they generate that kind of complexity, and there's sort of hidden complexity to things that seem like they're being completely explained and they're completely watertight, but actually there's a lot of subtle variation in there. So I've got really heavy and really deep into it. But what I wanted to stress is that as well as some of those kind of fairly deep ecological theories, I actually apply them to stories of memorable days and sort of relate that to, fishing tales on the bank. And that's a big part of the book is, enjoying some of those epiphany moments through, these really rewarding experiences on stream and sometimes frustrating experiences on stream, and, learning to value those as data points and not to be too caught up in your ego where things haven't worked out the way that you thought. Using that as a driver to try and understand why that might have happened and how you could potentially approach it in the future. So it's a kind of a mishmash of all those things, really.
Nice. And something you mentioned there about egos and everything else, that do you think, and there was something in one of the chapters, I think it was Being an Angler, where do you think anglers misuse or mislabel the term intelligent fish?
Yeah, I mean, I actually get on my soapbox a little bit on several topics, and I think I understand what is meant by it often, which is you get very difficult to capture fish that are displaying really sophisticated behaviours. But what I go to quite great lengths in the book to try and explain is that, look, some of these complex behaviours, they don't rely on having a huge intellect. You don't have to have the brain the size of a supercomputer. Termites display incredibly complex social cooperative behavior to build these incredibly intricate termite mounds that actually have functional air conditioning systems and little fungal farm systems and that kind of thing. And it's not because they're holding a kind of a toolbox meeting or a kind of a resources acquisition meeting at 9 p.m. on a Monday to kind of organize this stuff. It's because the selection pressures acting on those things have been very complex over the evolutionary past. So that can produce the illusion of, the intelligent, the reasoning trout that's thinking, there is an angler on the bank and they are trying to catch me and I will avoid that deliberately and sort of, and I'll win that contest. I don't think that's what's happening at all. I think what's happening is that they can be incredibly difficult to catch because the way that they interpret the environment to survive and reproduce means that they have to sort of, display these complex kind of adaptations and plasticity. The idea of, I go into habituation, the fact that, if you continue to experience the same stimulus, but you don't get any reward or any punishment for it, then that response just dials back. That sort of, there's a part of, the brain that just means that you're no longer responding to that stimulus. So that, for example, that explains why the fish in the middle of Bakewell, in the River Wye, you can walk right up to them because they're used to people walking up and down all day. Now, you go on the same river a few yards either side of that where you don't see people, then they disappear under the nearest bush at the slightest whiff of somebody sort of putting the nose over the horizon. So it kind of unpacks some of those apparent mysteries of intelligent behaviour, but shows that there can be these equally interesting and equally elegant sort of mechanisms behind that behaviour.
Let's come back to, you talk about being in praise of impressionistic flight patterns. What do you mean by that versus generic flight patterns then?
You could probably use those terms interchangeably, but I think what I'm trying to arrange a bit of appreciation for, if it's needed, it probably isn't, but the idea that there can be elegance and beauty in very, very simple, suggestive fly patterns, rather than only ever focusing on super realistic close copy things. Now, I have no problem with close copy patterns. I certainly endorse people who enjoy tying those and the art and the active creation of making those being enjoyable. I'm not trying to rain on anybody's parade in that sense. But what I'm also kind of trying to get at is, the idea that how few brushstrokes can you use to create the impression that is actually then accepted as a living insect or fish or whatever it is by a trout or a grayling. I think there's a beauty and an elegance in that. And I think that sort of paring down process where you may even be able to tick several different prey imitations in one fly because it does a good enough representation of the key triggers, the prey image that the trout is kind of using to actually select what's food from what is just debris in the environment. So I like that idea of, that when perfection can be when there's nothing left to take away rather than when there's nothing more to add to something that's, extremely kind of intricate and detailed. And I think it's a truer measure of whether you understand what is effective and why it might be effective when you have that sort of pared back approach. So I suppose that's where the slight distinction I'd maybe bring to impressionistic flies versus generic. Weirdly enough, I think impressionistic flies can be generic simply because they're able to tick boxes for several different prey items in terms of the response they trigger. But I suppose impressionistic is really a deliberate attempt to go for the minimum amount of what will achieve that aim. And again, in a strange practical advantage to that is that, if you spend 30 seconds tying a fly, you're probably a bit more willing to try and sort of get it under that bush or into that perfect hidey hole where, the biggest fish on the pool is obviously going to be sitting because, nobody can get a cast to it. If you treat your flies more as tools, that it's not the end of the world if you have to wade across the river and sort of retrieve it off a bush if you're able to, or, you're a bit less precious about something like that maybe than something that takes you 45 minutes to produce one copy of. So
yeah, that makes perfect sense. In my simplistic way, I've always felt that if fish are feeding well, that their natural caution is dialed back a little. Would you say that's fair comment and that you cover that in the book too?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I'd encountered like many times as an angler, and it's something that had, confused me, and I became curious about why that might be. But I think, I don't know, I've certainly had the experience where I was almost tempted to kind of try and poke a fish that's feeding really hard and that you should spook it, as soon as you get within, a few yards of it, and it's still just there feeding away. I'm kind of tempted to just try and see, well, how much is it going to take to actually spook this fish? Because I know if I come back next week and the hatch isn't as dense, that it's just going to disappear as soon as I kind of start to make a cast, But yeah, again, it's another one of connecting those sort of seemingly very disparate dots. There's some work done on sticklebacks and they're offered kind of a choice of very high density of Daphnia, the little water fleas, versus low density. And ordinarily, if they, the fish would prefer the high density, obviously, because they can, gain the most calories from that, and particularly if they're hungry. But interestingly, when there was the threat of a predator was introduced into that system, so they used model kingfishers, and I go into a little bit more detail because there's some subtle details in the book as well. But when they introduced a model kingfisher, those same hungry sticklebacks, instead of going for the most dense hatch, the most densely populated Daphnia offering, they then preferred a lower density, because what that allowed them to do was dedicate more of their brain capacity to being vigilant for predation. So they could feed a bit and they would still, help to avoid starvation, but at the same time they had more time and opportunity to look out for predators. And that's fascinating, because that could potentially explain situations where fish are ignoring seemingly the most dense hatch. Why are they not taking that hatch that's happening, and instead they're maybe picking off some aphids every now and again, instead of feasting on the big hatch of mayfly. Maybe that's to do with the number of cormorants that have been recently around, and how much attention they feel they need to apply to looking out for predators. And those indirect interactions and making those links, seemingly strange link between sticklebacks in an aquarium and some water fleas, to, well, why are they ignoring my mayfly pattern and instead they want to eat these aphids or whatever it is? So yeah, that's probably a good example. So thank you for teeing me up for that.
Well, I think it was worth mentioning. I've always felt that, as I said, in my simplistic way, that may be what they were thinking about, and that caution. And you've explained that perfectly for me. So I'm really pleased to hear that. You also talk about the difficult subjects of fish and their perception of pain. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please, as well?
Yeah, and I think that was probably one of the most difficult chapters to write. And I think in contrast to, chapter 7, being an angler, I think I enjoyed writing that chapter more than any other, because it just allowed me to kind of riff and pull from all the other building blocks that came up to that point. The bit on ethics actually comes after that, and it rounds up the book. And what I delve into there is the comparison between different philosophical approaches, whether it's a cost-benefit analysis, and that's something that we often I work for the Wild Trout Trust, as well as a number of other activities, and we're tasked with helping to manage wild ecosystems to their best potential. So you're often faced with difficult decisions, and in that situation, cost-benefit analyses are often very useful, versus a philosophical approach that's based more on rights. So whether that's animal rights or human rights or whatever. And I get a little bit into, the discussion of, how different individual rights often conflict with each other, but also the consideration of, well, how is this, if you're going to do a cost-benefit analysis, how do you properly quantify the negative side of that equation? So I talk about the positive side in relation to things like, I guess a good example is kind of Mortimer and Whitehouse. Nobody would be able to deny the kind of the well-being benefit that, has been represented in that particular show, and both in people's relationships with each other and, their relationships to their own health and that kind of thing. And fishing is an amazing vehicle for that. So that certainly sits on the kind of the positive side of the benefit side of that equation. In terms of the costs, it's really important to accurately quantify those, and characterize those negative impacts. And I pick out 2 studies that really bracket that whole argument quite neatly. And it really compares the conclusions of one of the papers, which it says that obviously fish are able to respond to stimuli that are damaging or painful, but that the brain structures that they don't have the equivalent structures or capacity to experience what we would characterize as the emotion of pain. So there's two things. There's the nerve impulse information that tells you to avoid something because it's damaging pain. That's one, pain receptors in one sense. And then there's the emotional experience of pain. And so one of the key papers that I say bracket this argument and debate, it basically suggests that there aren't the brain structures that would create that capacity for self-awareness and therefore for the experience of emotion on the one hand. On the flip side of that, there are very robust demonstrations of fish responding to painful stimuli. So there were a series of treatments that included various control measures. So there were fish that were handled but not otherwise treated. So that was one control. There were fish that were handled and had a saline injection in the lips, which was designed to be a kind of a control for the actual act of applying the treatment, which it was either bee venom or acid injection in the lips. And then they recorded the behaviors after that. And what they were looking for was this idea of guarding behaviors, which it might be something like limping on an injured limb would be a guarding behavior. So you're kind of consciously protecting that from further injury. And some of the evidence that come in the particular experiment I'm talking about in the book, they didn't really find evidence of guarding behavior, although that same research group subsequently did. But one of the things that I flag up in the book is that it's probably quite important to note that as anglers, we don't put acid and bee venom on our hooks. And so that the most similar treatment or condition, if you like, is probably that saline injection control, which it didn't invoke those extreme sort of pain responses. And so again, because I lean more towards this kind of pragmatic cost-benefit analysis, taken against the stresses and strains of what fish experience just in their daily survival, to me, it's an acceptably small impact, given that, with good handling and with good fish playing, you ought to be able to minimize the downside of that equation so that all of the amazing benefits, including, the motivation to conserve and protect rivers and everything that lives in them, let's realize those benefits by minimizing any of the potential downside. And so that even if you don't want to become or don't see that there's a value in, you have no ambitions to be a competition angler, let's say, you find that really distasteful, there's still a moral argument to improve your skills to a level whereby you can really effectively catch a fish and also release it, if, unharmed, and really minimize that so that you're not playing fish to exhaustion. You're not having to hold a fish and remove its outer coating and allowing that sort of fungal infection or osmotic balance to kind of get thrown out of whack because you're not necessarily using barbless hooks and you're not using the appropriate handling and keeping fish in the water wherever possible and wetting your hands if it's unavoidable and that kind of thing. So I think there's a moral driver to improve our skill at fishing, as well as just a kind of a personal satisfaction one. I think that's where that chapter kind of rounds up, is really laying out that cost-benefit argument and showing what's out there and accepting that not everybody will agree with my synthesis of it, and people will disagree with my standpoint, but at least I've laid out why it is that I hold those beliefs, and at least I've examined that and I'm comfortable with that, and that does allow me to enjoy my angling to a greater degree as well, I think.
Yeah, and you have my utmost respect for tackling such a difficult subject, reasoning it eloquently as well. And yeah, I think you as you've said there, you've laid the case out, and for people to make their decision from. So tell me, we've spoken over an hour now. Was it fun to write? Was it an interesting process to write for you?
Sorry, I was just kind of in such shock. I missed your last phrase there.
No worries at all. Was it fun? We've spoken sort of over an hour now. Was it an interesting process to write it? Was it a fun process to write?
It was, and I don't want to make this sound like it is kind of like some kind of massive epic effort, but I have been writing it on and off for about 12 years. That's in no way to suggest that it was 12 years of consistent effort. It's always been there, and it's always been niggling at me for a long time. And it's kind of, when time has allowed, I've been able to pick up that project and push it forward. And it's quite cathartic, really, to lay those things out on paper, and also to have the opportunity to express some of and share some of those things that are very personal to my experience of angling, and to try and understand that for myself selfishly, and then to hopefully share that with other people, and not just keep it to myself. And like, I've used the phrase, pulling up the ladder behind me. So it's like, brilliant, I've kind of joined these really interesting dots and it works really well, but screw you guys, I'm not going to tell you about any of this. So it's been really nice from both of those aspects, actually. And equally, I've enjoyed putting together the multimedia stuff that goes with it, because as good as written text is for kind of exploring and invoking the feelings and the ideas and the sort of some of the detail of it, there is a limit in sometimes in the clarity with which you can demonstrate something. So I've been careful to include sort of videos and illustrations and full color photos and things like that help to actually remove any of the barriers that might be there in the text. If you may be stumbling over a particular concept, there's some really nice presentations of how that idea actually works in a way that most 12-year-olds would be able to understand. In that kind of, it's attributed to Einstein. I'm not sure who said it really, but it's like, basically, if you can't explain something to a 12-year-old, you probably haven't really understood it yourself. So I've tried to do that with the supporting media, and that's been really fun to put that together as well. So it's not just the book on its own. Neither of them are standalone things. They both kind of come together and hopefully make a sensible whole. And I had the prompt this year to actually finish this project, regardless of whether it turned into a published book or not. It may have gone on to become an online course or whatever it is, but thanks to I kind of canvassed my email subscribers, and they were really supportive of the idea of publishing it as a book. So that really was a big boost, and it was a validation of that last year of effort. But a lot of that final push to actually complete all this came from me taking on fishing discoveries solely with my partner in crime, John Pearson, got a job offer he couldn't refuse, and he became an in-house videographer outside of fishing discovery. So I kind of took that on, and it's like, oh gosh, well, what am I going to create on my own? And that was like, well, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to go into such a personal project and to put that out there, and that gave me a little bit of courage to do that.
Fantastic. And I would say, for listeners, that the book, I think the timing of the release of the book is perfect, because it's one of those things that off season you can sit down and read, digest, and then when the new season comes again, or if you're out grayling fishing, you can put to use. So I'd stress it's not a scientific paper, but what it does, as I think I said at the beginning, it allows you to think about what you're doing. And I think that's a really important process of when we're on the water. We do it for enjoyment, and the reasons that Paul has said as well from a mental standpoint, but also think about why that fish is there. I often think about why I caught a fish, what it was doing, those sorts of things. And I think this book can only help that. I should also say that Paul hasn't paid to be on here. He has sent me an e-copy of the book, but I will be buying it as on the previous one, his nymph fishing book as well, which should be mentioned because we're coming into that time of year. I bought that as well. So I thought this was really cool for listeners to learn a little bit about and to promote something that I think we can all learn from. And I've learned from it, and I think we can all learn from it. So, Paul, I'd like to ask you, how can people get a copy of it? How can they find it? How can they find you if they haven't already?
That's well, I very much appreciate that. I've got the proof copy here, and I've actually changed the subtitle from hacking to decoding based on some feedback from my ever kind subscribers. But throughout October, so I think when this episode comes out, there'll be just a handful of days left in October. But October 2022 is the launch period for this book, and during that time, I'll be signing copies and individually numbering the first print run. And so in order to do that, you'll have to go to fishingdiscoveries.com/NOFF. So that stands for Nature of Fly Fishing. And that'll take you to the page where you can make your pre-order. Once the end of October rocks around, I'll tally up the orders. I'll get onto the printers and have some boxes delivered, and I'll sit for a good long time signing and numbering those. If you're listening to it outside of that time, I will go on to release it on Amazon as well. So if you prefer to get a copy that is printed more locally to you, depending on where you are in the world, then Amazon Print on Demand will hopefully fulfill that for you. So you just have to search for The Nature of Fly Fishing. Outside of that, you'll find all my musings on fishingdiscoveries.com. And that covers all. It's a reflection of my very broad tastes in angling and my background of an apprenticeship in various kinds of bait fishing and sea fishing, as well as fly fishing and more recently ultralight lure fishing as well. So there's a lot of different stuff on fishingdiscoveries.com. You'll find a contact email address for me on there and a contact form as well. That's a good way to get hold of me if you'd like to. But yes, as I say, if you want to get in before the end of October, fishingdiscoveries.com/NOFF.
Thanks for that, Paul. I'm going to be onto that very shortly. And it fascinated me as well that you said about a book that you can dip in and out of, which this one is certainly that. And as we're coming into that time of the year, can you remind us of the nymph fishing book as well, please?
Yeah, so the Fly Fishing Bible of Nymphing, it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek title, but the idea there was to, first of all, characterize the existing forms of Euro-nymphing as far as I could determine, because obviously these histories are not clear-cut. It then walks through some very fundamental descriptions on how you apply very clearly defined techniques. And so the idea is that you go through that first part of the book and try out some of those tactics. And then the rest of the book is dedicated to unpicking and saying why you shouldn't have distinct tactics. And actually what you need to do is mix and match and kind of design your own techniques based on the understanding of some of the fundamental building blocks. And it features quite a lot of interesting, to me at least, views inside competition anglers' fly boxes. So I've got very, very fortunate to have access to Stuart Croft's collection over the years that he's been, donated various competitors' flies. So there's a really unique insight there. Then it moves through onto building a framework of how you choose and use those techniques and apply those flies to the, with the system that best supports the characteristics of the flies that you're using. And so, yeah, it's again, it's not a kind of a rote learned thing. It's more about tuning your thinking to certain ways so that you're able to kind of improvise with those nymphing techniques. That one is a big coffee table format book with loads of full color diagrams and photos. So, yeah, it's a little bit of a contrast to this one, which is more of a novel sized thing, but equally it allows you to dip in and out of that. That one, too, also comes along with over 2 hours of video supporting material as well, that when you make that purchase, it automatically allows you access to that as an exclusive part of it. And again, it's designed to be consumed as a whole, not just as a standalone book. And that is available on Amazon right now, and that's the Fly Fishing Bible of Nymphing. Plus, you will be able to find the sales page for that on on fishingdiscoveries.com as well. If you want a signed copy, and obviously I get a slightly bigger slice of the royalties if you buy direct from me, but really it's about what works for you. So feel free to order through either of those media.
Fantastic. And I'll be dipping into that book very shortly. And also we did a podcast, which was a really great dive into nymph fishing. So if it's coming into that time of the year that we're starting to think about these setups and how we're going to approach the river. So if you haven't listened to it already, or perhaps even have a re-listen to it, so it may be of use to you. Paul, as ever, it has been brilliant to catch up with you. So much thanks for appearing as a guest on the Fly Culture podcast again.
You're so welcome. I'm just really pleased, and I'm so delighted that you've been generous enough to have me on again, Pete.
You are more than welcome. You are more than welcome. Everyone, this has been another episode of the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as me. And if you have, you'll consider subscribing. I'm told the reason for that is so that people can find this podcast and we can spread the word a little bit. But as ever, there'll be another one very, very soon. Thanks so much for listening.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.